Hey there, so this is what we're going to do today. We're going to build an Android REST client using Android Studio. We're going to use Spring REST. And what we have out here is our Visual Studio REST service running already. You can see if I go to Postman and I post a request to get the persons, those come back okay. So the server is already running, and we're going to go ahead and build the client using Android Studio. So I've already installed Android Studio. That takes a little bit of time and to get the emulators and everything. And just so you know my configuration, I've got Visual Studio running under Parallels, and I've got Android Studio running on the Mac. And ran into some problems trying to get Android Studio running under Windows under Parallels with the Android emulators running. So I'm using a tool called Conveyor, which is a Visual Studio plugin, and you see that running right here. And essentially what that does is it maps up a remote URL, and then I've added a firewall rule in Windows, and I will post the URLs to Conveyor and to the other tools that I'm using today in the description of this video. And in the Conveyor link, it tells you how to set the firewall rules and everything like that. So the point is Visual Studio wants to resolve everything to localhost, and this allows you to basically set this up to be more as if it were running on a normal web server instead of IIS Express, which is what Visual Studio uses. So we aren't going to really talk much more about Visual Studio 2017 and what we're doing there, other than just to be aware that it is running and that we are using that tool. So here's what you're going to need to do this. You'll need Android Studio installed, Visual Studio with a REST server running, and Conveyor if your client's not on the same system. And here's the tech we're going to be using today. So we're going to write this in Java, and we're going to use JSON as our format, as we have been doing for the other clients. We're going to be using REST, and we're going to be using Spring REST, which is a library that Spring is a set of libraries that you can use with Java development, kind of similar to .NET libraries a little bit, but just make it a lot easier to deal with things like building a REST client and talking to a web server. So that's what we're going to be doing, and it's going to look like this. We're going to build this client. It's going to be a native Android application. It's going to make a request over to our web API, and we're going to get a response back. Just like the iOS native client we did, I am going to make this very simple. I'm not going to spend a lot of time writing an Android program, so this is not about how to write an Android program as far as the UI goes. So let's save this off. We have this running, and let's go over here into Android Studio. Now it's going to get a little confusing because you'll see me bouncing back and forth between Windows and the Mac, but this is running on the Mac. So I'm going to start a new Android Studio project, and I'm going to call it REST Client. And I'll tell you, this working this example up took a little bit of time, just mainly because of just differences in how things work. The core REST concepts are the same, but it was a bit challenging. So we're going to be using, by the way, Android Studio is a free download from Google. It's based on the IntelliJ and tool that we use for professional Java development. So pick the basic activity as the template to use here to start with and hit next, and then just let the rest of this go to default. So it's going to go ahead and create one of these applications. It'll build a screen for us, and we're going to the first thing we'll do is start with a button. We're going to drop a button on here. There's two layouts. Make sure you're on the content.xml or content main XML. I'm just going to take this button and drag it over here and drop it. You'll see some button properties over here, very similar to what you might see in Visual Studio. I'm going to change the button to say REST GET, because we're just going to do a REST GET. That's all we're going to do to start with. If there's some interest, we may do the other verbs, but for now, we're just going to do that. And we are going to, under Java here, there's some test things that it creates, some tests. We're just going to be focused on the main activity class right here. And what we need to do first is we need to write an event handler for that button. And it looks like this: public void, and you can call it anything you want. I'm going to call it send message, but you can name it anything you want. And it takes a parameter of a view class, and we have that view parameter there. And with that, we can jump back over here and we can actually wire up that event handler. So it's not showing up yet, but I'm going to just go ahead and type it in. It'll usually show up in the pull down, but it hasn't had a chance to rebuild the app yet. So we can just do a rebuild on this real quick. And sometimes the initial builds on these take a while, so I may pause the video if it starts lagging a little bit, just so we're not waiting on that. That only took a minute or so, but it can take a little bit of time. So in any case, the first thing I really want to do is I want to make sure that that thing's actually working and going to call my class the way I want it to. Plus, I want to see my little Android app run. So what I'm going to do is set a breakpoint right here. And this really isn't a lesson in how to use Android Studio. I'm assuming you know how to use it. We'll hit the debug button here after we've set a breakpoint. I have already set up this Nexus 5X API 24 virtual device for Android. So it's just a Nexus phone emulator, essentially. And so I'm going to go ahead and get this running. So the emulator's coming up. And again, I'll pause this while it brings everything up. There's different emulators you can use. It took a couple of minutes for that to come up, and I don't recommend that you close these unless you're having problems with the emulator, because it does take a while for them to launch again. You obviously can be running this against a phone that's connected through USB, but I'm just going to do it this way. So I'm going to hit the button, and I hit my breakpoint, so that's working. So that's good. All right, now we're going to go down through a list of different things that we need to do. We want to build a person Java class. That's the first thing we're going to do. So let's do that real quick. So this is going to be what in Java, in the Java world, we call a POJO, or plain old Java object. And essentially what this is a class that only contains properties. It doesn't have any methods in it. And the purpose of this is to give us a thing to catch our response that comes back and map it into an object for us, so that we don't have to sit there and parse the JSON. You saw us do this in .NET. We had an object that we set up, so it's the same concept. So right here on this node, I'm going to right click and select New Java Class. I'm going to call it Person. You'll remember our model is a person class, and I'm just going to hit OK. And this class, we aren't going to actually put getters or setters in it. We are going to set JSON properties that map to the actual JSON fields that we're going to be getting. We know that we have an ID field like this. And then what we'll do is private ID. So we're going to set up our different properties that way. And when you get a underscore like this, so it can't resolve this because we need an import. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in here. And actually, I'm probably going to have to go and do some dependency management before I can do this. So let me pause for just a minute before we complete this exercise. So let me just delete this stuff, because let me go ahead and add in the other things that we're going to need here. So We know that we have first name, and we know that we have last name. So I have some imports that I need to include, and we're going to do that through the dependency management system. And so rather than fight that right now, we're just going to go ahead and put these in, and then we'll come back around and put in the JSON annotations. Oops. This is going to be pay rate and private. So there's a Java date type, and we'll get a red underscore on that, but we will fix that. And okay, so these guys here can be handled through so that'll take care of those. All right, so let's do that. All right. So what we want to do next is under build Gradle, and it's there's two of them in here. We want the one that says module. We're going to be adding some dependencies right here. So make sure these dependencies are in, and they look like this. There's a compile directive. I'm not going to go into detail what all these are. They're necessary for this example. We got that one, and this is what we're going to pull in the Spring framework that we're going to be using. Now when I do this, most Java tools have some type of a dependency manager where they try to go out and resolve dependencies, pull in packages that they need to, and it's kind of cool. It kind of keeps everything updated and ready to go, but it can cause a few problems when you're trying to build things quickly. So one way to force that is you can close the development environment and reopen it, or you can clean and build the project sometimes. Sometimes it can get a little bit wonky. I don't think there's a fair amount of complexity involved in that, and so most of the tools work most of the time, but occasionally you get a few hiccups. So all right, so those are you'll notice the faster XML was the one I started to add on the other one, and so this this will get those dependencies in. And so let me do this. Let me do clean, and let's do a rebuild on this. And while it's getting things set up, we want to look at the Android manifest as well. So if you'll open that up, in order for the phone to use the internet and to reach out and make a REST call, there's a directive that you need to put in here that allows that. So we want uses permission Android name equals Android dot permission dot internet. That's the permission we need to add, just like that. So that's just a little That's just a little flag that needs to be there. Let me do one thing real quick and see if this will help. I want to see if we can help with the font here. I guess we're already running that larger font. So hopefully you can see all of this okay. But this is what we just added right here. And I spelled it wrong. So, right, like that. Hopefully in typing these in, I don't make a mistake. I know if you're typing these in, you know that's always a danger. So I'm going to go back and recheck these real quick and just make sure that there's no issue. Because if any of this is wrong, it can cause some problems. So org.springframework.android:spring-android-rest-template 1.0.1.release, and then compile com.faster.xml Jackson core Jackson databind 232. Okay. So you'll notice down here it said Gradle sync completed a minute ago. So that's telling you that it's gone out and resolved the dependencies, or tried to at least. All right, let's jump back over to our POJO. Remember that stands for plain old Java object. And now, let's put this in. And now you'll notice it comes up with a hint. If I hit Alt-Enter, it'll put the import in for us, and now we're good. So we need to annotate each of these properties. Now this seems a little bit weird if you're used to a normal Java object with getters and setters. You don't actually build getters and setters. This is simply used as a mapping object to build up an object from the JSON payload when it comes in. So this is exactly how you need to do this. And so we're annotating each one of these to say, hey, the end date thing coming in from Java matches to this field. Now you'd think that it could just use the name, but what I found is it's not there. At least in certain cases, it doesn't. Specifically, if there's some keywords involved, like ID. So I'm annotating everything just to make sure that it works. All right. Okay. So now let's go back to our main activity. All right, so we're going to have a fair amount of code that we're going to need to be typing in here, and it is sometimes a bit challenging to keep track of all this. So, but we'll go ahead and do it. So this is going to take a little bit of time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put this in. I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to type this in, and then I'm going to review the code, because that'll be quicker than watching me kind of fat finger type around it. So I'm going to pause the video while I bring that code in, and I'll show you exactly what I did. All right, so we've got that code added, and I'm going to walk through this. First of all, there's a whole bunch of imports that got added here. And this tool, Android Studio, is really good about that. Let's start down here with our send message. So I've added some code here, and basically what I'm doing is I'm setting up the URI of the REST service that I'm going to call, and I'm calling this new REST task, and I'm calling an execute. Now, if you remember how we set this up on iOS, we did an async call. So the idea is that when you make this REST call, that it makes an asynchronous call, and it basically, when it is finished with the call, you'll get notification. And so the code structure here is around building that async capability. So don't worry too much about this part right now. What I did was I added a new class called REST task, which extends async task less than string comma void comma response entity person. So this is our async class that we're going to be using, and inside of it, it has a response entity person that it returns, and it says do in background. These are the parameters that it uses, and it grabs the URI that's coming in, and it sets up a new REST template. So this is Spring code here, Spring REST. So we get a new REST template, We set up the message converters, and we're using the Jackson to HTTP message converter, and that will map the JSON into the object for us. We set up our headers. HTTP headers equals new headers because we've got some headers to pass. We start by setting up the API key that's necessary because this endpoint is guarded by an API key. You've got to pass that specific API key in, and you probably have a different value for your API key, or you may not have the API key at all, and either one of those is fine. Next, we need to set up our actual authentication, and the user ID and password we're using is Jack Jones. Jack is the user ID, Jones is the password. Bad user ID and password, I know. Certainly you don't want anything like that in a production system. We're just testing here. And then essentially what we're doing here is building up, we're encoding that, we're base64 encoding that, and we're setting up the auth header and setting up an authorization header to pass as well. And so now we get this HTTP entity object that is built with the headers. So you see all of that. And finally, right here, we're going to call the REST template exchange method, passing it the URL, telling it which verb we're doing, which is a get, giving it the entity, which contains our headers, telling it that we want a person class back, and we will get back that person. There are other ways that you can make calls using REST, the Spring REST response. Let's take that code out. And we will return the response back out of this. If there's any exception, we'll return a null response, and we just have a get message in here. So I will set a breakpoint here, and I'm going to set a breakpoint. We'll kind of walk through this code a little bit so you can see it. And then down here, so this is the code that gets called once the async request and response has completed. So this routine actually would have the code that the code that you, the response code and the object that comes back from our get. And we'll be able to see those as well. Now, there's another reason why we did this async. You might say, well, wait a minute, just getting a person back is not going to take much time. There is a rule with Android development, and that is that you cannot create threads. You can't do this kind of a call on the UI thread. And so we are basically getting out of the way of the UI and letting this call the way it's supposed to. So anyway, this is what the code looks like. I'm going to go through it really slow again, or leave it on the screen so that you can see it. That's the main part of it. Again, this class extends all the way down to here. So all of this is one class that I've added in line. You certainly don't have to have it in line. And then I've modified the send message here. Okay. All right. So I think we're ready to run this. Oh, and the imports. Okay. So all of these were brought in. Okay, let's see what happens. So here's our emulator running. It'll go a lot faster this time because it's already up and running, assuming we don't have any compiler errors. You'll notice down here at the bottom what's going on with the compiler. And we got a failure in the build. So it looks like I've got a bit of a typo going on here, so I will fix that and come right back. Okay, so in our dependency here, in the build.gradle, we have some packaging options that need to be added. So make sure you get this in. Notice where it comes in. There's a closing curly brace here right before the dependencies, and I've dropped it in right after build types. So we need to make sure that these packaging options are there to exclude these files. With that, this should work. So it's doing a build. And looks like we're good now. I don't see it deploying, so I'm going to stop this. Try to run that again. Like I said before, sometimes these get hung a little bit. There's a lot of things going on here with this, so it's a real challenge to have a whole phone emulator with operating system running here and link this into the tools so you can actually debug. So I'll hit the REST GET, and so now what's happened is the send message got picked up and it called this REST task execute, which causes this to go off and do the background task. And so we're just going to walk through this a little bit and watch it. So here's the headers getting set up. And if you wanted to look at those, you could. And then what we want to have happen here is this is the thing that's actually making the REST call. And it came back, and you'll notice what it came back with right here. And there's our response. So if we hover over this, you'll see this is what's coming back. But you'll see we got our 200 OK back. And we'll just hit continue. So now it's coming back out and saying, okay, we got this result, which is that whole string, and now we can actually parse out the person object. And so now we have that in this person returned. So we have an object, and here it is. Item 1 was Silly Luba. We jump back over to Postman. That's the one we got, was this one right here. So we did the same thing as this call that we've done in Postman. So everything worked like it was supposed to. So I hope that that was useful for you to kind of see how to put all this together. There's obviously a lot of moving parts here, but once you get everything set up right, it's pretty straightforward. Spring REST certainly makes it easy to make this call. So hopefully this is useful for you. If there's interest in a little bit more Android development, certainly let me know, and we can do some more verbs or even tie this into the UI. So when the button is clicked, it could put the results back up on the screen. So I hope that was useful for you, and let's see, here's a better view. Here's the person here. Here's our status code 200 coming back. So you can see all of that data coming back through the way it's supposed to. So good luck with the Android development, and this proves that once again that REST is a great tool because we can hit that Visual Studio REST Web API service written in C#, running under Windows from another operating system, in this case Android, and another language, Java, and another tool like Spring REST. So good luck with the Android development, and please let me know if there's other videos that you're interested in. Also, I'd appreciate it if you like this video, if it's been useful to you, or post comments. Thanks.